Before this video begins, I would like to give a quick thank you to my Asban Team level patrons Fallon Cortez and Nathan Gibson. Thank you so much for supporting the channel. So a couple of weeks ago, Doctor Who made its big Christmas return with The Church on Ruby Road, kickstarting the 15th Doctor's era and essentially softly rebooting Doctor Who as a whole. It was an episode that introduced us to a brand new Doctor, a brand new companion, a brand new sonic screwdriver, and it all set up Series 14 as a whole. But the main thing everyone is talking about when it comes to The Church on Ruby Road is the mysterious Mrs. Flood, Ruby Sunday's neighbour who initially seems very ordinary, only for a mid-credit scene to reveal she knows what a TARDIS is, suggesting she's a lot more important than we first thought. Showrunner Russ T. Davies has already revealed that Mrs. Flood is a slow burn mystery, so we probably won't even get any actual answers until like Series 15 next year, but that hasn't stopped fans speculating on her true identity. Therefore I thought it might be fun to go through all the main theories and see how likely they are, along with offering up my own predictions. After all, it's a long time until Series 14 in May, so I've got to keep myself busy somehow. When it comes to any mysterious character, the leading fan theory will always be some variation of the Master, the Rani, Rassilon, or any other rogue or evil Time Lord from the show's long history. Naturally, this was pretty much the first thought most fans seem to have had about Mrs. Flood, mainly because of her recognising the TARDIS upon seeing in action. Of course, if anyone is going to recognise a TARDIS, it's the people who made them. So this theory does somewhat make sense, especially with how Mrs. Flood acts towards the start, acting a little bit villainous and spiteful towards her neighbour Abdul.
I've seen you looking.
However, I'm not a huge believer in this theory, mainly just because I think it would be too unoriginal and boring. It's almost too easy of a reveal to have her as the Master or the Rani. There's also the whole complicated rights issues of the Rani to take into account. It's not an easy character to bring back into Doctor Who media, something I've gone into detail about before. Both the Master and the Rani are known to use disguises, as is the Monk. We've seen many examples of these villains hiding themselves to blend in, but I just don't get that vibe from Mrs. Flood. Apart from that interaction with Abdul, she doesn't seem like an outright suspicious or sinister character. Therefore, I'd probably give the evil Time Lord theory a 2 out of 5 because it just doesn't seem very creative or likely. So we've talked about evil Time Lords, but what about the good ones? A lot of fans have speculated that Mrs. Flood might be Romana, a former companion of the 4th Doctor, who ultimately left him to make her own way back to Gallifrey. In expanded media, she ended up as the president of Gallifrey, but there's never been any indication of that within the show itself, so there is a little bit of leeway for her fate. However, I really can't see Mrs. Flood being Romana. Similar to the evil Time Lords, she wouldn't think the TARDIS is a normal police box, because they obviously don't have those on Gallifrey. Any Time Lord in Mrs. Flood's position would immediately assume it is the Doctor's TARDIS, rather than thinking it's a harmless police box. And no, I don't think there's going to be any chameleon arches or fob watches anywhere. I think the Romana theory is even more unlikely than the evil Time Lords, especially with Mrs. Flood asking the Doctor who he is at the end. If it's Romana, she'd immediately know who he is. So 1 out of 5. However, a slightly more interesting theory is Iris Wildtime, a fairly obscure expanded media Time Lord mainly portrayed by Katie Manning. Iris is a very hard to summarise character, but one of her main traits is breaking the fourth wall because she knows she's in a piece of media, which obviously kind of matches up to the ending where Mrs. Flood directly addresses the camera.
Never seen a TARDIS before.
There's also the indication that she seems to be able to retain memories from the aborted timeline without Ruby, since she saw the TARDIS dematerialise and then somehow wasn't surprised when she saw it in the real timeline. However, again, much like Romana, Iris is already very familiar with the Doctor and his TARDIS, so she probably wouldn't be reacting the way Mrs. Flood does.
Who are you anyway?
It's an interesting theory though. I'd probably give it a 3 out of 5 because it feels a little bit more likely than Romana or the evil Time Lords, although I do feel like Iris Wildtime is a bit too much of a deep cut to introduce within the first 2 series of Doctor Who's soft reboot. But speaking of this new era, the answer may lie in a little bit of more recent material. Since his return with the Star Beast, Russell T Davies has set up a lot of mysteries for the future of Doctor Who. That episode saw Beat for Meep allude to having some kind of boss who'd be interested to hear about the Doctor and his meddling in the plan. Given how the 60th anniversary specials are officially part of this new era, it wouldn't be too far-fetched for Mrs. Flood to be involved with, or the answer to, one of the many mysteries introduced in those episodes. We have no no context as to who this enigmatic boss might be, but given that Beep the Meep only came to Earth to escape the Wrath Warriors, it's hard to believe that the boss would also be dwelling on Earth, let alone hanging out in a London neighbourhood living a normal life for seemingly no reason. You know, she's not doing what the Grand Serpent did. Her meeting with the Doctor seems entirely coincidental, and she actually seems happy to see him in the TARDIS at the end of the episode rather than wanting some level of revenge. I really don't think Mrs. Flood is a villainous character. She doesn't seem to give off that impression with how much she seems to love the Doctor and Ruby. Therefore, I'd probably give the boss theory a 2 out of 5. It's solid on paper, but it just doesn't quite fit together in a plausible way. It's the same case for the One Who Waits, an ominous figure mentioned by the Toymaker in The Giggle. Given the Toymaker's nature as essentially a god more powerful than almost everything else in the entire history of the Doctor Who universe, it's hard to believe the being even he fears would just be settling down to live that boring life as Mrs. Flood. Of course, it could be a situation similar to Tortuous Adam, where she hasn't actually existed there for long at all, but I just don't find it very likely. So I'd give the One Who Waits theory a 1 out of 5. It really doesn't match up to the suggestion by the Toymaker. One of the most interesting theories that my mind almost immediately went to after the Church on Ruby Road is the idea of Mrs. Flood being an old companion from the past, or the older version of a companion we haven't even met yet. First of all, I want to say I don't think she's a former companion from the show's history. It doesn't really match up to any companion profile. There's no way it's Susan, that would be just as lame as the Master or the Rani. Dodo is a bit more of a realistic outcome, especially with how Mrs. Flood seems to not want to see a police box again, which could line up with Dodo's trauma from her time travelling with the Doctor. However, the ages of Dodo in universe and actor Anita Dobson don't really add up, so I'm hesitant to support the idea. Lastly, there's Victoria, although that character was 15 when she left to live in England around 1968, creating a similar age issue to Dodo. I just don't think there's any classic Who companion that fits the mould of Mrs. Flood, so I'd have to give the theory a 2 out of 5. However, I do really enjoy the idea of her being a companion we haven't actually met yet, someone who travels with the Doctor in the future of the show. I think that would be a really great reveal for the character, playing with the time-travelling nature of the show similar to River Song all the way back in Series 4. However, the issue with the police box TARDIS once again creates problems with this, because Mrs. Flood doesn't recognise the Doctor, asking who he is. If she had travelled with him, she'd obviously know exactly who he is, so unless she travelled with a future incarnation, that theory is immediately dead in the water with another 2 out of 5. Okay, so we've waded through some of the worst and most creatively redundant theories. I think it's now time to take a look at some of the more realistic and likely ones. First of all, it's entirely possible that Mrs. Flood is somehow Ruby's real mum, or at least the woman who left the new companion on the doorstep of the church. The ages are again a bit tricky here and work against the theory, but Mrs. Flood definitely has a strange soft spot for Ruby, which we see early on in the episode as she takes a break from her argument with Abdul to have a cheery conversation with Ruby. It's a very interesting introduction to the character, especially later on as she's the one to encourage Ruby to take that brave step into the TARDIS. I definitely think there's something deeper tying Mrs. Flood to Ruby, although given that Ruby mentions at the start of the episode that they've only recently moved to London, it does make it unlikely that Mrs. Flood is her real mother or some sort of guardian. But that being said, you never know with Doctor Who. There's still a lot of evidence suggesting she doesn't have such a direct link to Ruby, but I do like the idea of her knowing more about the companion's origins than we do, so I'd give this theory a 4 out of 5. There's a very strange element of the Church on Ruby Road that I think a lot of people might have overlooked. I alluded to it earlier, but the brief glimpse into the aborted Ruby-less timeline gives us a pretty interesting hint about Mrs. Flood. At the start of the episode, she thinks the TARDIS is just a normal police box, something that used to be very common in the UK. She mentions having not seen one in London for 50 years. Then, in the alternate timeline where Ruby was never born, she sees the Doctor dematerialise in the TARDIS, which seems like just a silly little moment of her being shocked at a box disappearing. But this moment doesn't seem exclusive to that alternate timeline, because when the Doctor returns to the real timeline after saving Ruby, Mrs. Flood is waiting outside all smiles and waves, not at all shocked to see the Doctor appearing in this magical box. It's a very slight detail that does kind of get overshadowed because of the scenes before and after it, so I think a lot of people missed how weird it is that Mrs. Flood is suddenly so happy to see the Doctor, despite never having seen the TARDIS disappear in the aborted timeline. In the actual timeline, she should be shocked all over again. Whether this means Mrs. Flood has the ability to experience different timelines, I don't know, but I like to think that for the majority of the episode, she was an entirely normal person, only for the Doctor to somehow accidentally change something in the past or the alternate timeline that triggered an entire character change for Mrs. Flood in the present day, leading to that sudden knowledge of the TARDIS and embracing it at the end. Or maybe something managed to enter the universe and possess her, or just all sorts of weird little things that changed her halfway through the episode. I love it when little changes in the past have drastic consequences for characters, like the finale of Primeval Series 1, so I adore the idea of Mrs. Flood having gone through a huge character shift like this, and I'm willing to give it a 5 out of 5 as a theory. It's a very clever use of the show's time travelling nature, and would be a fascinating setup for a character like this. But in a world of good Time Lords, evil Time Lords, impossible entities, and hidden parentage, I think the answer to Mrs. Flood's identity is actually the most simple and easy one. She's just a brand new character. Doctor Who fans love to get themselves worked up predicting who characters are and how they have to link into the past of the show, but sometimes they really just don't. We've seen this happen so many times before, most recently with Vinda and Belle from Flux, who weren't the Doctor's real parents like a lot of people theorise. They were literally just two brand new characters, and I think Mrs. Flood is very much the same. She's not Susan Foreman or River Song. I think she just happens to be a completely new original character who knows what a TARDIS is. I have no idea how or why she knows, but that's the fun of the mystery. Not everyone has to be a returning character, so I think the truest, most 5 out of 5 theory of them all is that Mrs. Flood is just someone completely new and everything will be explained in due course. Like I mentioned, it's not always a Yana or Missy situation. Mrs. Flood isn't the Meeps boss or a terrifying entity even the Toymaker fears. She's not the Master or the Rani. It's often the simplest, most obvious answer that there is no big return. Again, just look at Swarm and Azure for example, who were entirely new villains despite a wave of fan speculation about who they could really be. I have no clue if Mrs. Flood is going to be a secret villain or just an ally with secrets, but it's definitely a success for the show to have created a mystery like this that has the entire fanbase speculating and theorising. But what do you think? Do you have a Mrs. Flood theory I didn't cover? Let me know in the comments. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, I'll see you next time. Bye bye. And I'd just like to quickly thank my Bantam level patrons, Fallon Cortez and Nathan Gibson, my Diamond level patron, Glenna Clark, my Platinum level patrons, Matthew Burns and Maximilian Foreman, and all my Gold level patrons, Boots, Daniel Shillito, Franzorn aka Alarm Vortex, Leigh Marie Farrell, Robert Hock, and Tom Azar. Thank you so much for your support.